that the only thing standing between you and a dream job is building the courage to step off the expected path. I argued that it was this courage culture that led Lisa Fewer to quit her corporate job to chase an ill-fated yoga venture. This culture also plays a big role in egging on the less successful members of the lifestyle design community. In light of the second control trap, I need to moderate my previous disdain. Courage is not irrelevant to creating work you love. Lulu and Lewis, as we now understand, required quite a bit of courage to ignore the resistance generated by this trap. The key, it seems, is to know when the time is right to become courageous in your career decisions. Get this timing right, and a fantastic working life awaits you. But get it wrong by tripping the first control trap in a premature bid for autonomy, and disaster lurks. The fault of the courage culture, therefore, is not its underlying message that courage is good, but its severe underestimation of the complexity involved in deploying this boldness in a useful way. Imagine, for example, that you come up with an idea for injecting more control into your career. As I argued earlier, this is an idea worth paying attention to, because control is so powerful in transforming your working life that I call it the dream job elixir. Also imagine, however, that as you toy with this idea, people in your life start offering resistance. What's the right thing to do? The two control traps make this a hard question to answer. It's possible that you don't have enough career capital to back up this bid for more control. That is, you're about to fall into the first control trap. In this case, you should heed the resistance and shelve the idea. At the same time, however, it's possible that you have plenty of career capital, and this resistance is being generated exactly because you're so valuable. That is, you've fallen into the second control trap. In this case, you should ignore the resistance and pursue the idea. This, of course, is the problem with control. Both scenarios feel the same, but the right response is different in each. By this point in my quest, I've encountered enough stories of control going both right and wrong to know that this conundrum is serious, perhaps one of the single most difficult obstacles facing us in our quest for work we love. The cheery slogans of the courage culture are obviously too crude to guide us through this tricky territory. We need a more nuanced heuristic, something that could make clear exactly what brand of control trap you're facing. As you'll learn next, I ended up discovering this solution in the habits of an iconoclastic entrepreneur, someone who has elevated living his life by his own rules to an art form. Chapter 11. Avoiding the Control Traps, in which I explain the law of financial viability, which says you should only pursue a bid for more control if you have evidence that it's something that people are willing to pay you for. Derek Sivers is a control freak. Not long into his 2010 TED Talk on creativity and leadership, Derek Sivers plays a video clip of a crowd at an outdoor concert. A young man without a shirt starts dancing by himself. The audience members seated nearby look on curiously. A leader needs the guts to stand alone and look ridiculous, Derek says. Soon, however, a second young man joins the first and starts dancing. Now comes the first follower with a crucial role. The first follower transforms the lone nut into a leader. As the video continues, a few more dancers join the group. Then several more. Around the 2-minute mark, the dancers have grown into a crowd. And ladies and gentlemen, that's how a movement is made. The TED audience gives Derek a standing ovation. He bows, then does a little dance himself on stage. No one can accuse Derek Sivers of being a conformist. During his career, he has repeatedly played the role of the first dancer. He starts with a risky move designed to maximize his control over what he does and how he does it. By doing so, he's at risk of looking like the lone nut dancing alone. Throughout Derek's career, however, there always ended up being a second dancer who validated his decision and then eventually a crowd arrived, defining the move as successful. His first risky move occurred in 1992 when he quit a good job at Warner Brothers to pursue music full-time. He played guitar and toured with the Japanese musician and producer Ryuichi Sakamoto, and by all accounts was pretty good at it. His next big move was in 1997 when he started CD Baby, a company that helped independent artists sell their CDs online. In an age before iTunes, this company filled a crucial need for independent musicians, and the company grew. In 2008, he sold it to disc makers for $22 million. At this point in his career, conventional wisdom dictated that Derek should move to a large house outside of San Francisco and become an angel investor. But Derek was never interested in conventional wisdom. Instead, he put all of the proceeds from the sale into a charitable trust to support music education, living off the smallest possible amount of interest allowed by law. He then sold his possessions and began traveling the world in search of an interesting place to live. When I spoke with him, he was in Singapore. "I love that the country has so little gravity. It doesn't try to hold you here. It's instead a base from which you can go explore," he said. When I asked him why he's living overseas, he replied, "I follow a rule with my life that if something is scary, do it. I've lived everywhere in America, and for me, a big scary thing was living outside the country." After taking time off to read, learn Mandarin, and travel the world, Derek has recently turned his sights on a new company, Muckwork. This service allows musicians to outsource boring tasks so they can spend more time on the creative things that matter. He started the company because he thought the idea sounded fun. Here's what interests me about Derek. He loves control. His whole career has been about making big moves, often in the face of resistance, to gain more control over what he does and how he does it. And not only does he love control, but he's fantastically successful at achieving it. This is why I got him on the phone from Singapore. I wanted to find out how he achieved this feat. In more detail, I asked what criteria he uses to decide which projects to pursue and which to abandon. In essence, I wanted his map for navigating the control traps described in the last 2 chapters. Fortunately for us, he had a simple but surprisingly effective answer to my question. The law of financial viability. When I explained what I was after, Derek got it right away. "You mean the type of mental algorithm that prevents the lawyer who has had this successful career for 20 years from suddenly saying, 'You know, I love massages. I'm going to become a masseuse,'" he asked. "That's it," I replied. Derek thought for a moment. "I have this principle about money that overrides my other life rules," he said. "Do what people are willing to pay for." Derek made it clear that this is different from pursuing money for the sake of having money. Remember, this is someone who gave away $22 million and sold his possessions after his company was acquired. Instead, as he explained, money is a neutral indicator of value. By aiming to make money, you're aiming to be valuable. He also emphasized that hobbies are clearly exempt from this rule. If I want to learn to scuba dive, for example, because I think it's fun and people won't pay me to do that, I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway, he said. But when it comes to decisions affecting your core career, money remains an effective judge of value. If you're struggling to raise money for an idea, or are thinking that you will support your idea with unrelated work, then you need to rethink the idea. At first encounter, Derek's career, which orbits around creative pursuits, might seem divorced from matters as prosaic and crass as money. But when he re-narrated his path from the perspective of this mental algorithm, it suddenly made more sense. His first big move, for example, was to become a professional musician in 1992. As Derek explained to me, he started by pursuing music at night and on the weekend. "I didn't quit my day job until I was making more money with my music." His second big move was to start CD Baby. Again, he didn't turn his attention full-time to this pursuit, until after he had built up a profitable client base. "People ask me how I funded my business," he said. "I tell them first I sold one CD, which gave me enough money to sell two. It grew from there." In hindsight, Derek's bids for control remain big and nonconformist. But given his mental algorithm on only doing what people are paying for, they now also seem much less risky. This idea is powerful enough that I should give it its own official-sounding title: The Law of Financial Viability. When deciding whether to follow an appealing pursuit that will introduce more control into your work life, seek evidence of whether people are willing to pay for it. If you find this evidence, continue. If not, move on. When I began reflecting on this law, I saw that it applied again and again to examples of people successfully acquiring more control in their careers. To understand this, notice that the definition of willing to pay varies. In some cases, it literally means customers paying you money for a product or a service. But it can also mean getting approved for a loan, receiving an outside investment, or more commonly, convincing an employer to either hire you or keep writing you paychecks. Once you adopt this flexible definition of pay for it, this law starts popping up all over. Consider, for example, Ryan Voiland from Red Fire Farm. Many well-educated city dwellers fed up with urban chaos buy some farmland and try to make a living working with their hands. Most fail. What makes Ryan different is that he made sure people were willing to pay him to farm before he tried it. In more detail, because he wasn't a rich ex-banker, buying his first property required a loan from the Massachusetts Farm Services Agency, and the FSA does not give away its money easily. You have to submit a detailed business plan that convinces them that you'll actually make money with your farm. With 10 years of experience on his side, Ryan was able to make this argument. Lulu provides another good example of this law in action. Here, the definition of willing to pay concerned her paycheck. She judged her moves toward more autonomy by whether or not someone would hire her or keep paying her while she made them. Her first big move, for example, was to drop to a 30-hour-per-week schedule. She knew she had enough capital to support this change because her employer said yes. In later jobs, when she negotiated a 3-month leave or insisted on working freelance with an open schedule, these were also bids for more control that were validated by the fact that her employers accepted them. If she had had less career capital, they would have had no problem telling her goodbye. On the flip side, when you look at stories of people who were unsuccessful in adding more control to their careers, you often find that this law has been ignored. Remember Jane from earlier in Rule Number 3. She dropped out of college with the vague idea that some sort of online business would support a lifestyle of adventure. If she had met Derek Sivers, she would have delayed this move until she had real evidence that she could make money online. In this case, the law would have served its purpose well, as a simple experiment would have likely revealed that passive income websites are more myth than reality, and thus prevented her rash abandonment of her education. This doesn't mean that Jane would have had to resign herself to a life of boring work. On the contrary, the law could have provided her structure to keep exploring variations on her adventurous life vision until she could find one to pursue that would actually yield results. Summary of Rule Number 3. Rules Number 1 and Number 2 laid the foundation for my new thinking on how people end up loving what they do. Rule Number 1 dismissed the passion hypothesis, which says that you first have to figure out your true calling and then find a job to match. Rule Number 2 replaced this idea with career capital theory, which argues that the traits that define great work are rare and valuable, and that if you want these in your working life, you must first build up rare and valuable skills to offer in return. I call these skills career capital, and in Rule Number 2, I dived into the details of how to acquire it. The obvious next question is how to invest this capital once you have it. Rule number 3 explored one answer to this question by arguing that gaining control over what you do and how you do it is incredibly important. This trait shows up so often in the lives of people who love what they do that I've taken to calling it the dream job elixir. Investing your capital in control, however, turns out to be tricky. There are 2 traps that commonly snare people in their pursuit of this trait. The first control trap notes that it's dangerous to try to gain more control without enough capital to back it up. The second control trap notes that once you have the capital to back up a bid for more control, you're still not out of the woods. This capital makes you valuable enough to your employer that they will likely now fight to keep you on a more traditional path. They realize that gaining more control is good for you, but not for their bottom line. The control traps put you in a difficult situation. Let's say you have an idea for pursuing more control in your career and you're encountering resistance. How can you tell if this resistance is useful? For example, it's helping you avoid the first control trap. Or something to ignore. For example, it's the result of the second control trap. To help navigate this control conundrum, I turned to Derek Sivers. Derek is a successful entrepreneur who has lived a life dedicated to control. I asked him his advice for sifting through potential control-boosting pursuits, and he responded with a simple rule. Do what people are willing to pay for. This isn't about making money. Derek, for example, is more or less indifferent to money, having given away to charity the millions he made from selling his first company. Instead, it's about using money as a neutral indicator of value, a way of determining whether or not you have enough career capital to succeed with a pursuit. I called this the law of financial viability, and concluded that it's a critical tool for navigating your own acquisition of control. This holds whether you are pondering an entrepreneurial venture or a new role within an established company. Unless people are willing to pay you, it's not an idea you're ready to go after. Rule number 4, think small, act big, or the importance of mission. Chapter 12, The Meaningful Life of Pardee Sabeti, in which I argue that a unifying mission to your working life can be a source of great satisfaction. The Happy Professor. Harvard's state-of-the-art Northwest Science Building is found at 52 Oxford Street in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a 10-minute walk from the tourists packing the university's famed Central Yard. It's part of a complex of hulking brick and glass laboratories that form the new heart of Harvard's fabled research engine. Inside, the Northwest looks like a Hollywood vision of a science lab. The hallways defining the perimeter of each floor are polished concrete and lit dimly in the style of television crime procedurals. Inside the hallways in the center of the building are the wet labs, with graduate students manipulating pipettes visible through windowed steel doors. On the other side of the hallway are the professors' offices, defined by floor-to-ceiling glass partitions. It was one of these offices in particular that drew me to the Northwest on a sunny June afternoon. The office of Pardee Sabeti, a 35-year-old professor of evolutionary biology who had mastered one of the more elusive but powerful strategies in the quest for work you love. One of the first things you'll notice if you spend time around Pardee is that she enjoys her life. Biology, like any high-stakes academic field, is demanding. Because of this, it has a reputation for turning young professors into curmudgeons who adopt a masochistic brand of workaholism, in which relaxation becomes a sign of failure and the accomplishments of peers become tragedies. This can be a bleak existence. Pardee, for her part, has avoided this fate. Not 5 minutes into my visit, for example, a young grad student, one of 10 people Pardee employs in her eponymous Sabeti lab, pokes his head into the office. "We're heading down to volleyball practice," he says, referencing the lab's team, which evidently takes itself seriously. She promises to join them as soon as our interview ends. Volleyball is not Party's only hobby. In a corner of her office, she keeps an acoustic guitar that serves as more than decoration. Party plays in a band called Thousand Days, which is well known in Boston music circles. In 2008, PBS featured the band in a Nova special called Researchers Who Rock. Party's energy for these activities is a side effect of her enthusiasm for her work. The bulk of her research focuses on Africa, with studies ongoing in Senegal, Sierra Leone, and most of all, Nigeria. To Party, this work is about more than just the accumulation of publications and grant money. At one point in our conversation, for example, she pulls out her laptop. "You have to see this video of me and my girls," she says, loading up a YouTube clip of Party, guitar in hand, leading a group of 4 African women in a song. The video was shot outdoors in Nigeria. Palm trees provided the backdrop. The women, I learn, work in a clinic supported by the Sabeti Lab. These women deal with people who die in devastating ways every day, she says to no one in particular while the video plays. On screen, everyone is smiling while Party leads them with mixed success through the verses. "I love going there," she adds. "Nigeria is my African home." It's clear that Party has avoided the grinding cynicism that traps so many young academics and has instead built an engaging life. "It's not always easy," she once said in an interview, "but I truly love what I do." But how did she pull off this feat? As I spent time with Party, I recognized that her happiness comes from the fact that she built her career on a clear and compelling mission, something that not only gives meaning to her work, but provides the energy needed to embrace life beyond the lab. In the overachieving style typical of Harvard, Party's mission is by no means subtle. Her goal, put simply, is to rid the world of its most ancient and deadly diseases. Party's mission. As a graduate student, Party stumbled into the emerging field of computational genetics, the use of computers to help understand DNA sequences. She developed an algorithm that sifts through databases of human genetic information, looking for traces of an elusive target: ongoing human evolution. To the general public, the idea that humans are still evolving can be surprising, but among evolutionary biologists, it's taken for granted. One of the classic examples of recent human evolution is lactose tolerance, the ability to digest milk into adulthood, a trait that didn't start spreading through the human population until we domesticated milk-producing animals. Party's algorithm uses statistical techniques to hunt down patterns of gene migration that match what you would expect from selective pressure. For example, a mutation that popped up recently in human development, but has since spread quickly among a population. The algorithm, in other words, searches blindly, turning up candidate genes that look like they're the result of natural selection, but leaving it up to the researcher to figure out why natural selection deemed the gene useful. Party uses the algorithm to search for recently evolved genes that provide disease resistance. Her logic is that if she can find these genes and understand how they work, biomedical researchers might be able to mimic their benefit in a treatment. It makes sense, of course, that disease resistance genes would be among the candidates turned up by Party's algorithm, as they provide a classic example of natural selection in action. If a deadly virus has been killing off humans in a population for a long time, biologists would say that this population is under selective pressure. If a lucky few members of the group then happen to evolve a resistance to the disease, this pressure ensures that the new gene will spread quickly. People with the new gene die less frequently than those without it. This rapid spread of a new gene is exactly the type of signature Party's algorithm has been tuned to detect. Party's first big discovery was a gene that provides resistance to Lassa fever, one of the oldest and most deadly diseases of the African continent, responsible for tens of thousands of deaths each year. People don't just die with this disease, she emphasized. They die extreme deaths. She has since added malaria and the bubonic plague to the list of ancient scourges that she's tackling with her computational strategy. Pardey's career is driven by a clear mission: to use new technology to fight old diseases. This research is clearly important, an observation emphasized by the fact that she's received 7-figure grants for her work from both the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the NIH. Later in this audiobook, we'll dive into the details of how she found this focus, but what's important to note now is that her mission provides her a sense of purpose and energy, traits that have helped her avoid becoming a cynical academic and instead embrace her work with enthusiasm. Her mission is the foundation on which she builds love for what she does, and therefore, it's a career strategy we need to better understand. The power of mission. To have a mission is to have a unifying focus for your career. It's more general than a specific job and can span multiple positions. It provides an answer to the question, what should I do with my life? Missions are powerful because they focus your energy toward a useful goal, and this, in turn, maximizes your impact on your world, a crucial factor in loving what you do. People who feel like their careers truly matter are more satisfied with their working lives, and they're also more resistant to the strain of hard work. Staying up late to save your corporate litigation client a few extra $1 million can be draining, but staying up late to help cure an ancient disease can leave you more energized than when you started. Perhaps even providing the extra enthusiasm needed to start a lab volleyball team or tour with a rock band. I was drawn to Pardey Sabeti because her career is driven by a mission, and she's reaped happiness in return. After meeting her, I went searching for other people who leveraged this trait to create work they love. This search led me to a young archaeologist whose mission to popularize his field led to his own television series on the Discovery Channel, and to a bored programmer who systematically studied marketing to devise a mission that injected excitement back into his working life. In all 3 cases, I tried to decode exactly how these individuals found and then successfully deployed their missions. In short, I wanted an answer to an important question. How do you make mission a reality in your working life? The answers I found are complicated. To better understand this complexity, let's put the topic back into the broader context of the book. In the preceding rules, I have argued that follow your passion is bad advice, as most people aren't born with pre-existing passions waiting to be discovered. If your goal is to love what you do, you must first build up career capital by mastering rare and valuable skills, and then cash in this capital for the traits that define great work. As I'll explain, mission is one of these desirable traits, and like any such desirable trait, it too requires that you first build career capital. A mission launched without this expertise is likely doomed to sputter and die. But capital alone is not enough to make a mission a reality. Plenty of people are good at what they do, but haven't reoriented their career in a compelling direction. Accordingly, I will go on to explore a pair of advanced tactics that also play an important role in making the leap from a good idea for a mission to actually making that mission a reality. In the chapters ahead, you'll learn the value of systematically experimenting with different proto-missions to seek out a direction worth pursuing. You'll also learn the necessity of deploying a marketing mindset in the search for your focus. In other words, missions are a powerful trait to introduce into your working life, but they're also fickle, requiring careful coaxing to make them a reality. This subtlety probably explains why so many people lack an organizing focus to their careers, even though such focus is widely admired. Missions are hard. By this point in my quest, however, I had become comfortable with hard, and I hope that if you've made it this far in the audiobook, you have gained this comfort as well. Hardness scares off the daydreamers and the timid, leaving more opportunity for those like us who are willing to take the time to carefully work out the best path forward and then confidently take action. Chapter 13, Missions Require Capital, in which I argue that a mission chosen before you have relevant career capital is not likely to be sustainable. Mission failure. When Sarah wrote me, she was stuck. She had recently quit her job as a newspaper editor to attend graduate school to study cognitive science. Sarah had considered grad school right out of college, but at the time, she worried that she didn't have the right skills. With age, however, came more confidence, and after she signed up for and then aced an artificial intelligence course that would have scared a younger version of myself, Sarah decided to take the plunge and become a full-time doctoral candidate. Then the trouble started. Not long into her new student career, Sarah became paralyzed by her work's lack of an organizing mission. "I feel I have too many interests," she told me. "I can't decide if I want to do theoretical work or something more applied, or which would be more useful. Even more threatening, I believe all the other researchers to be geniuses. What would you do if you were in my shoes?" Sarah's story reminded me of Jane, whom I introduced in rule number 3. As you might recall, Jane dropped out of college to start a nonprofit to develop my vision of health, human potential, and a life well lived. This mission, unfortunately, ran into a harsh financial reality when Jane failed to raise money to support her vague vision. When I met her, she was soliciting advice about finding a normal job, a task that was proving difficult because she lacked a degree. Both Sarah and Jane recognized the power of mission, but struggled to deploy the trait in their own working lives. Sarah desperately wanted a Pardee Sabeti style of life-transforming research focus, yet her failure to immediately identify such a focus led her to rethink graduate school. Jane, on the other hand, slapped together something vague, a nonprofit that would develop my vision of a life well lived, and then hoped the details would work themselves out once she got started. Jane fared no better than Sarah. The details, it turned out, did not work themselves out, leaving Jane penniless and still without a college degree. I tell these stories because they emphasize an important point. Missions are tricky. As Sarah and Jane learned, just because you really want to organize your work around a mission doesn't mean that you can easily make it happen. After my visit to Harvard, I realized that if I was going to deploy this trait in my own career, I needed to better understand this trickiness. That is, I needed to figure out what Pardee did differently than Jane and Sarah. The answer I eventually found came from an unexpected place: the attempts to explain a puzzling phenomenon. The baffling popularity of randomized linear network coding. As I write this chapter, I'm attending a computer science conference in San Jose, California. Earlier today, something interesting happened. I attended a session in which 4 different professors from 4 different universities presented their latest research. Surprisingly, all 4 presentations tackled the same narrow problem: information dissemination in networks, using the same narrow technique, randomized linear network coding. It was as if my research community woke up one morning and collectively and spontaneously decided to tackle the same esoteric problem. This example of joint discovery surprised me, but it would not have surprised the science writer Steven Johnson. In his engaging 2010 book, Where Good Ideas Come From, Johnson explains that such multiples are frequent in the history of science. Consider the discovery of sunspots in 1611. As Johnson notes, 4 scientists from 4 different countries all identified the phenomenon during that same year. The first electrical battery, invented twice in the mid-18th century. Oxygen, isolated independently in 1772 and 1774. In one study cited by Johnson, researchers from Columbia University found just shy of 150 different examples of prominent scientific breakthroughs made by multiple researchers at near the same time. These examples of simultaneous discovery, though interesting, might seem tangential to our interest in career mission. I ask, however, that you stick with me, as the explanation for this phenomenon is the first link in a chain of logic that helped me decode what Pardee did differently than Sarah and Jane. Big ideas, Johnson explained, are almost always discovered in the adjacent possible, a term borrowed from the complex system biologist Stuart Kauffman, who used it to describe the spontaneous formation of complex chemical structures from simpler structures. Given a soup of chemical components, sloshing and mixing together, noted Kauffman, lots of new chemicals will form. Not every new chemical, however, is equally likely. The new chemicals you'll find are those that can be made by combining the structures already in the soup. That is, the new chemicals are in the space of the adjacent possible defined by the current structures. When Johnson adopted the term, he shifted it from complex chemicals to cultural and scientific innovations. We take the ideas we've inherited or that we've stumbled across, and we jigger them together into some new shape, he explained. The next big ideas in any field are found right beyond the current cutting edge, in the adjacent space that contains the possible new combinations of existing ideas. The reason important discoveries often happen multiple times, therefore, is that they only become possible once they enter the adjacent possible, at which point anyone surveying this space, that is, those who are the current cutting edge, will notice the same innovations waiting to happen. The isolation of oxygen as a component of air, to name one of Johnson's examples of a multiple discovery, wasn't possible until two things happened. First, scientists began to think about air as a substance containing elements, not just a void. And second, sensitive scales, a key tool in the needed experiments, became available. Once these two developments occurred, the isolation of oxygen became a big fat target in the newly defined adjacent possible, visible to anyone who happened to be looking in that direction. Two scientists, Carl Wilhelm Scheele and Joseph Priestley, were looking in this direction, and therefore both went on to conduct the necessary experiments independently, but at nearly the same time. The adjacent possible also explains my earlier example of four researchers tackling the same obscure problem with the same obscure technique at the conference I attended. The specific technique applied in this case, a technique called randomized linear network coding, came to the attention of the computer scientists I work with only over the last 2 years, as researchers who study a related topic began to apply it successfully to thorny problems. The scientists who ended up presenting papers on this technique at my conference had all noticed its potential around the same time. Put in Johnson's terms, this technique redefined the cutting edge in my corner of the academic world, and therefore it also redefined the adjacent possible, and in this new configuration, the information dissemination problem, like the discovery of oxygen many centuries earlier, suddenly loomed as a big target waiting to be tackled. We like to think of innovation as striking us in a stunning eureka moment, where you all at once change the way people see the world, leaping far ahead of our current understanding. I'm arguing that in reality, innovation is more systematic. We grind away to expand the cutting edge, opening up new problems in the adjacent possible to tackle and therefore expand the cutting edge some more, opening up more new problems, and so on. The truth, Johnson explains, is that technological and scientific advances rarely break out of the adjacent possible. As I mentioned, understanding the adjacent possible and its role in innovation is the first link in a chain of argument that explains how to identify a good career mission. In the next section, I'll forge the second link, which connects the world of scientific breakthroughs to the world of work. The capital-driven mission. Scientific breakthroughs, as we just learned, require that you first get to the cutting edge of your field. Only then can you see the adjacent possible beyond. the space where innovative ideas are almost always discovered. Here's the leap I made as I pondered Pardis Sabeti around the same time I was pondering Johnson's theory of innovation. A good career mission is similar to a scientific breakthrough. It's an innovation waiting to be discovered in the adjacent possible of your field. If you want to identify a mission for your working life, therefore, you must first get to the cutting edge, the only place where these missions become visible. This insight explains Sarah's struggles. She was trying to find a mission before she got to the cutting edge. She was still in her first 2 years as a graduate student when she began to panic about her lack of focus. From her vantage point as a new graduate student, she was much too far from the cutting edge to have any hope of surveying the adjacent possible. And if she can't see the adjacent possible, she's not likely to identify a compelling new direction for her work. According to Johnson's theory, Sarah would have been better served by first mastering a promising niche, a task that may take years, and only then turning her attention to seeking a mission. This distance from the adjacent possible also tripped up Jane. She wanted to start a transformative nonprofit that changed the way people live their lives. A successful nonprofit, however, needs a specific philosophy with strong evidence for its effectiveness. Jane didn't have such a philosophy. To find one, she would have needed a nice view of the adjacent possible in her corner of the nonprofit sector, and this would have required that she first get to the cutting edge of efforts to better people's lives, a process that, as with Sarah, requires patience and perhaps years of work. Jane was trying to identify a mission before she got to the cutting edge, and she predictably didn't come up with anything that could turn people's heads. In hindsight, these observations are obvious. If life-transforming missions could be found with just a little navel-gazing and an optimistic attitude, changing the world would be commonplace. But it's not commonplace. It's instead quite rare. This rareness, we now understand, is because these breakthroughs require that you first get to the cutting edge. And this is hard, the type of hardness that most of us try to avoid in our working lives. Those who have been paying attention will notice that this talk of getting to the cutting edge echoes the idea of career capital, which was introduced back in Rule Number 2. As you'll recall, career capital is my term for rare and valuable skills. It is, I argued, your main bargaining chip in creating work you love. Most people who love their work got where they are by first building up career capital and then cashing it in for the types of traits that define great work. Getting to the cutting edge of a field can be understood in these terms. This process builds up rare and valuable skills and therefore builds up your store of career capital. Similarly, identifying a compelling mission once you get to the cutting edge can be seen as investing your career capital to acquire a desirable trait in your career. In other words, mission is yet another example of career capital theory in action. If you want a mission, you need to first acquire capital. If you skip this step, you might end up like Sarah and Jane, with lots of enthusiasm, but very little to show for it. Not surprisingly, when we return to the story of Pardis Sabeti, we find that her path to a mission provides a nice example of this career capital perspective translated into practice. Pardis' patience. I think you do need passion to be happy, Pardis Sabeti told me. At first, this sounds like she's supporting the passion hypothesis that I debunked in Rule Number 1. But then she elaborated. It's just that we don't know what that passion is. If you ask someone, they'll tell you what they think they're passionate about, but they probably have it wrong. In other words, she believes that having passion for your work is vital, but she also believes that it's a fool's errand to try to figure out in advance what work will lead to this passion. When you hear Pardis' story, the origin of this philosophy becomes clear. In high school, I was obsessed with math, she told me. Then she had a biology teacher whom she loved, which made her think that biology might be for her. When she arrived at MIT, she was forced to choose between math and bio. It turns out that the MIT Bio Department has an unbelievable emphasis on teaching, she explained. So I majored in bio. With a bio major came a new plan. She decided she was destined to become a doctor. I perceived myself as someone who cared about people. I wanted to practice medicine. Pardee did very well at MIT, won a Rhodes Scholarship, and used it to go earn her PhD at Oxford. She focused on biological anthropology, a typically archaic Oxfordian name for a field most would simply call genetics. It was at Oxford that Pardee decided that Africa and infectious diseases were also a potentially interesting topic to study. If you're keeping count, this was the third field that at some point in her student career attracted her. The full list now contains math, medicine, and infectious disease. This is why she's wary of the strategy of trying to identify your one true calling in advance. In her experience, lots of different things can, at different times, seem compelling. Given her new interest in Africa, Pardee joined a research group using genetic analysis to help African Americans trace their genealogy back to regions of Africa. After a year or so, Pardee decided to switch labs, and she moved into another, suggested by a friend. This lab was tackling the genetics of malaria. After Oxford, Pardee returned to Harvard Medical School to earn her MD. Amazingly, even as she was finishing up a PhD in genetics, she wasn't ready yet to abandon her earlier premonition that she was somehow meant to be a doctor. The result was that she became a young med student, finishing a PhD thesis during her spare time. If you want to write a thing about having a quality, enjoyable life, don't ask me about my time at Harvard, she warned. Harvard was a tough time. Pardee finished her dissertation and became a postdoctoral fellow, continuing to juggle this work with the end of her MD program, taking the subway back and forth between Harvard and MIT, where she was now working at the Broad Institute with the famed geneticist Eric Lander. It was during this period that her ideas about using statistical analysis to find evidence of recent human evolution began to yield results, culminating in the 2002 publication of a major paper in Nature with the innocuous title, Detecting Recent Positive Selection in the Human Genome from Haplotype Structure. According to Google Scholar, the work has been cited over 720 times since its publication. People started treating me differently after that paper, Pardee says. That's when the faculty offers started coming in. Though she finished her MD somewhere in this period, it was not until this point that her mission finally became clear. Becoming a clinical doctor didn't make sense. She was going to build a research career focused on her use of computational genetics to combat ancient diseases. Pardee took a professorship at Harvard, finally ready to commit to a single focus in her working life. What struck me about Pardee's story is how remarkably late it was in her training before she identified the mission that now defines her career. This lateness is best represented by her decision to still attend and finish medical school, even though she was working on PhD research that was starting to attract notice. These are not the actions of someone who is certain of her destiny from day one. This certainty didn't come until later, around the time of her Nature publication, when Pardee had finally developed her computational genetics ideas to the point where their usefulness and novelty were obvious. To use my terminology, this long period of training, starting with her undergraduate biology classes and continuing through her PhD and then postdoctoral work at the Broad Institute, was when she was building up her stores of career capital. When she took a professorship at Harvard, she was finally ready to cash in this capital to obtain the mission-driven career she enjoys today. Rule number 4 is entitled, Think Small, Act Big. It's in this understanding of career capital and its role in mission that we get our explanation for this title. Advancing to the cutting edge in a field is an act of small thinking, requiring you to focus on a narrow collection of subjects for a potentially long time. Once you get to the cutting edge, however, and discover a mission in the adjacent possible, you must go after it with zeal, a big action. Pardee Sabeti thought small by focusing patiently for years on a narrow niche, the genetics of diseases in Africa. But then, acting big once she acquired enough capital to identify a mission, using computational genetics to help understand and fight ancient diseases. Sarah and Jane, by contrast, reversed this order. They started by thinking big, looking for a world-changing mission, but without capital they could only match this big thinking with small, ineffectual acts. The art of mission, we can conclude, asks us to suppress the most grandiose of our work instincts, and instead adopt the patience, the style of patience observed with Pardee Sabeti, required to get this ordering correct.